Hi, everyone. My name is David McLennan. I'm the CEO of the City of Vincent, and I'm also the chair of the WA chapter of the National Regulators Community of Practice. And welcome to this joint webinar between NRCOP and, for the first time, the Australasian Environmental Law Enforcement and Regulators Network, AELERT. You may be a member of one, both, or none of these communities of practice, but I invite you to join us to share your experiences, for us to learn from each other, and to help improve our regulatory craft at all levels of government. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I pay respects to their elders past and present. And I'd like to acknowledge First Peoples from all our countries and pay my respects to them. We honour their wisdom and their stewardship of traditional lands, waters and customs which enrich us all. Today's webinar is all about the craft of regulation in local government. This can be a really tough gig. There are regulatory staff across more than 400 local governments in Australia. And if they're not tuned, or if you're not tuned into this webinar right now, those regulators are out in the field plying their craft. There might be some regulators in Sydney and Melbourne who are still recovering from the approvals process for the Taylor Swift concerts in Sydney and Melbourne, having to manage the crowd safety and control, the safe access and egress points, and also, one of the most tricky things, deciding on what the legal noise limit can be for those concerts. And from what I heard, they may not have been successful at enforcing those noise limits. At the City of Vincent, our regulators are out and about, and on any given day, they might be responding to an emergency where a building's burnt down and released asbestos into the atmosphere. They might be called out in early morning to a GP clinic whose oxygen tank has exploded and made the building structurally unsound. Our regulators here might be responding to a burst sewer pipe, which is spilling raw sewage into a local park. Our rangers may be having to permanently remove a much-loved dog from their owners after an attack. Our building compliance staff might be having to condemn a house, somebody's home, which we've deemed to be structurally unsound and no longer fit for human habitation. Or our environmental health officers might be trying to manage contamination of soil and water of a burst fuel tank at the local service station. Our planners are approving major property developments. Our health inspectors might be responding to reports of food poisoning at a local restaurant. And we also might be responding to reports of illegal dumping of waste in our streets. Before I introduce our speakers for today's webinar, just a few points of housekeeping. All our webinars are recorded and will be made available on the ANZOG YouTube channel, and links will be provided in the NRCOP and AELERT communication channels. We will also be preparing short videos of key points that you'll be able to access through our social media platforms. We are using our Q&A function in Zoom for questions. I encourage you to add questions as you go. There will be time for questions with the speakers after their introductory remarks. I'll be going to those questions which are most popular with our audience and those that are being upvoted the most, so I encourage you to do that. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can, but if you have any questions offline for any of our speakers, we'd be most happy to respond in writing after the webinar. If we have any technical issues, hold on. If the webinar live stream cuts out, stay with us. The NRCOP team will be working behind the scenes in the background to get the stream back up ASAP. But if your internet connectivity cuts out, please just restart your internet and rejoin the Zoom webinar. Our speakers for today's event are Greg Abboud, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Australasian Environmental Law Enforcement and Regulators Network. Hi, Greg. With over 25 years' experience as a regulator, Greg is seconded from the National Resources Access Regulator, NAAR, where he was the Director of Education Engagement and previously the Director of Water Regulation. Susie Senadisi is the Strategy Manager of Environment in Local Government New South Wales. Susie is responsible for a team that advocates on environmental issues relevant to local government, including biosecurity, biodiversity, natural resource management, waste and recycling, among others. And Sam Ferrier is the Manager of Community Safety at Hume City Council, overseeing their local laws, public and environmental health, and emergency management. Sam has been involved in a series of legislative updates, policy enhancements, and resource planning and development initiatives to align Council's regulatory approach with community expectations and standards. Today's focus is on regulation in local government, but regulation is only one of 4 key roles of a local council. The other 3 roles are around the service delivery function, delivering community services like waste, parks, libraries, and recreation, or the partnering role of a local government, partnering with external stakeholders to deliver on community and economic development initiatives and services. And a local government is also an advocate and facilitator for their local area. But it's often the regulatory role of local government that can be the most tricky and most challenging. Some of you might have heard from Robin Wright at ANZOG and his analogy of the blunt end and the sharp end of the regulatory knife. To state the obvious, local government is definitely at the pointy end of this regulatory knife. It is often the state government that holds the blunt end of the knife and is responsible for a raft of legislation which accounts for most of the regulation in planning, environment, public health, traffic, building, and biodiversity that the local governments are in charge of enforcing. State governments are always trying to tweak and reform and update their legislation, some of which might be decades old and some of which may be newer. And a small tweak at that blunt end of the regulatory knife can end up being quite a sharp movement for the local councils that are trying to implement these rules, regulations, and policies on the ground with our community, with our small businesses, and our regulated parties. So let's kick off and hear from our speakers about some of the challenges, tricks, and tips of how to survive and thrive when trying to juggle multiple sharp knives at once. And I'll start with Greg and ask him to provide a quick introduction to A-Alert and what your local government members are saying about the key challenges facing them at the moment. Over to you, Greg.
Thanks, David, and thanks for your opening remarks. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm sitting on here today, the land of the Bidjigal people, one of 29 clans of the mighty Eora Nation, always was, is, and always will be Bidjigal land. And just quick intro, people. Good news that Alert and NRCOP are official collaborators in our networks. We signed up an MOU at the start of this month, which is good news for all those Alert members out there and people associated with NRCOP, because we're better together, and it gives our members options, more surface area, and we're going to spend the years to come energising each other's network. And thanks to Miriam and Rose and your teams for making that happen, half of that happen on your half, and I look forward to the future. So a little bit about Alert. Alert is a regulators network. It's a safe place for regulators to support each other. It's been operating for about 20 years, just over 20 years now, and that's its bread and butter. It's a safe hub for regulators to support each other across 3 levels of government: local, state, and federal. It's a regulatory stewardship platform, which means that it's a platform where regulatory agencies support it and stay connected. It's also a place where they work together on some of those wicked regulatory problems that we face that are common across jurisdictions. And importantly, alert members cut across environmental, non-environmental, and most of our members do both. Local governments do both environmental and non-environmental, like what you mentioned before, David. So that's the substance of Alert. It's there to facilitate collaboration, which gives rise to the innovation between us. So we're not isolated, we're not alone, and that will grow our collective capability together. Local governments have had a long history in Alert and are a very sizable part of Alert's membership. The majority of Alert members are local governments. The history with local governments in Alert goes back 15 plus years to leaders like Greg Sullivan, throughout the leadership of Alert current day leaders like Derek Poulton from Lake Macquarie Council, who's the National Council rep. So it's part of Alert's DNA, and part of that means that myself and the rest of the leadership team are committed to serving our Alert members who are from local government. And the first thing we need to do there is to have contemporary understanding of knowing their needs and how the network and the other members across the network can support local governments. So late last year, we do that in two ways, face-to-face engagement with members, but also late last year, we released a survey. There was a good response from that survey. About 110 local governments responded. And the feedback that we got was really consistent with what we hear day to day from our local government members. And there's really 5 key areas of pain points, of challenges, of risks that we are focusing our mitigation and our network support on. Those 5 are isolation and the disconnect sometimes between state and federal governments. 2 is resources, lack of. 3 is workload, reactivity of it, and David, as you mentioned, the wicked spread of it. 4 is the regulatory capability of their people, and 5 is the lack of operation and support. So that's where our attention as a network is, and with our partners, to help support local governments in building those connections between local governments through communities of practice, like our 16 communities of practice, 1 in local government, 1 in biodiversity and protected area where all the parkies are. They're run by local government practitioners, but also supports in our resource library and formalised programs like Twinning program and our work programs. The other area that we're really focused on is making accessible a structured approach to regulatory capability of people, of practitioners, through our regulatory capability framework, and that ties in really nicely with some of NRCOP's products, including their professional regulators program, and putting some certainty around that and some transparency by using Alert's regulatory officer self-assessment tool. So practitioners and their managers know exactly where they're at, where they need to head, takes out the guesswork. And just lastly, strong agencies mean strong people. So focusing on building maturity up of regulatory agency in things like our risk-based approach, regulatory posture, regulatory philosophy and governance and oversight helps mitigate against workload and resourcing, particularly about isolation. So David, they're the focus areas. That's what we learned from our engagement with local government, and it continues forever and ever and ever. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, I really think the work of both NRCOP and A-Alert is highly complementary, and great to be bringing the 2 organisations together. I'm now going to hand over to Susie to talk a little bit about what it is unique about being a regulator in local government. Welcome, Susie.
So what I wanted to talk about was a little bit about what's unique about being a regulator in local government. And I guess my personal experience is mainly from being in a regulatory role in state government. But in the last 10 years with Local Government New South Wales, I've had a lot of opportunity to speak with local government regulators to hear their experiences and learn from them. So while it's not firsthand, I feel I've had a really great overview across local government, particularly in New South Wales. The first, I guess, aspect I wanted to cover was that, and has been discussed already, that councils cover multiple areas of regulatory, of legislation, of issues. In fact, sometimes I like to think of them as mini state governments, because they do cover things like water, the public health, roads and transport. So there's quite a diversity of issues that they might be across. In particular, in New South Wales, they might be covering companion animals, weeds, food safety, UPSS, contaminated land, etc. So the other aspect is that not all councils are the same. And there are large councils, there are small councils, there's urban and regional and remote councils. And with that, there's a variation in the resourcing available to councils for that regulatory component in particular, which also then converts to staffing on the ground, and that the way that councils structure their regulatory functions also differs depending on a lot of those factors. So in particular, I tend to see a difference between urban or metropolitan councils, typically better resourced. They might have a team of regulators that can specialise a little bit more in particular areas, whereas your regional or remote councils may only have the one officer who's trying to do the building inspections, as well as checking what's happening, making sure that the landfill's operating correctly, as well as doing, the companion animals enforcement as well. So there's quite a diversity of roles and diversity of what local government regulators are doing on the ground. I think a fairly unique challenge for local government regulators is often they are living in the communities that they are regulating in, which means that there's a greater level of scrutiny and pressure. But it also, I guess, means that they need to be and are more aware of the approach that they take, where collaboration and education is plays a big part of that the spectrum. And I guess in terms of building capability with local government regulators, things that they appreciate are things like tools and templates for fines and letters and notices, etc. Providing, sharing of case studies and models and experience learning peer-to-peer is a really big one, and that's why it's something like this and the ALERT group and NICOP are so important. And then succession planning and ongoing training, professional development is also really fundamental, I guess, for anybody in their role, but particularly for regulators, keeping up to speed, learning approaches and sharing with one another. So that's all I wanted to cover.
Thanks, Susie. I'll go over to Sam now, who manages quite a large and complicated regulatory team at Hume City Council. So Sam, over to you for some introductory remarks to help set the scene before our Q&A session.
Thanks so much, David. Wonderful to be here. So in my 5 minutes, I was hoping to provide a little bit more of an insight really around what does regulation look like within a local government organisation itself, i.e. how is it organised, who's involved, and what do those various officers do? So as mentioned at the outset, I'm Sam. I'm Council's Manager of City Safety at Hume City Council. We're a very large growth municipality that's located on Melbourne's north. And in this role, I have oversight across a range of different teams, including environmental and public health, city laws and litter response, parking services, emergency management and municipal fire prevention, and also council's prosecutions area. And I think that it's not uncommon to see these very large and diverse groupings of different areas within local government, where there's multiple areas that are brought together under sort of a single department or division who are all undertaking this regulatory work. So the officers who work within my team are authorised and perform a number of regulatory functions under both state and local legislation and frameworks. And I'm not going to mention all of those frameworks or legislation, but they include things like the Public Health and Wellbeing Act, the Food Act, the Environmental Protection Act, Council's own local laws, the Emergency Management Act, the Domestic Animals Act, alongside the Fire Rescue Victoria Act and the Country Fire Authority Act. And as David alluded to in sort of his introductory remarks, day to day, the duties of these officers is very, very diverse. It includes monitoring and compliance activities, both with regulated entities and within the community. It includes investigating breaches of non-compliance. It includes community education and capacity building. It includes management of permit and registration systems. It includes things like test purchasing and sampling, alongside pursuing matters of non-compliance through court processes, including the Magistrates' Court and other level of court. So the officers across those teams are also incredibly diverse and have a diverse range of skills and qualifications. So some of the officers who are in our team have specific qualifications and follow formalised, I guess, training and development pathways that are necessary for them to be authorised and undertake duties under their act, such as our environmental or public health officers. In other roles, officers require perhaps a certificate level qualification or participate in relatively short training courses before they come on board with us. Some of those officers are very, very skilled in areas around investigative practice and preparing briefs of evidence that might be used as part of a court prosecution, while others are really skilled in areas such as assessment, auditing, or performing technical tests that I mentioned earlier. And I think that despite those various skills, qualifications, and duties of those different officers, they all play this really important and critical role in this broad area of regulation, which is ultimately focused around protecting and promoting the health, safety, and amenity outcomes within our local community. And I think that it's really important, you know, in my view, that these officers working in these areas have that opportunity to connect in with that broad, to form an understanding of that broader regulatory role of council, and to understand and appreciate how their role contributes to that bigger picture and mandate. I myself am quite new to the regulatory area, having been in the role for about 18 months. And I have to say that it's been a really, really steep learning curve. Early on, I had a huge number of questions, being someone who's quite analytical by nature. For example, in a resource-constrained environment, where do we focus our efforts? What matters or breaches should be responded to with an education-based response versus an enforcement sort of focused response? How do we measure regulatory success? Are there some areas where a more proactive approach is favourable to a reactionary approach? How do we best tackle issues that intersect across jurisdictions, both internally and with external agencies? And when I went looking for some of these answers, answers to these questions, I came across groups like ANZOG, NRCOP and A-Alert, and have found their networks, courses and materials absolutely critical in navigating some of those questions, but also driving some of that internal improvement here at Hume City Council. So very excited to be involved in today's discussion and to be able to raise awareness of the really important regulatory role of local government.
Thanks, Sam. You talked about managing and responding, the difference between a proactive or a reactive approach to regulation. If anyone listening does work in local government, you know there's a steady stream of complaints coming in from all over the place on particular issues. And when you're low on resources, or you're struggling with skills, or getting key staff into these regulatory roles, you can be essentially caught on the back foot, having to be 100% reactive and just trying to respond and deal with complaints as they come in. But there's a whole gradation and spectrum of regulatory responses, Sam, from that promotion, education piece, taking people slowly up the path to try to bring them into compliance, or where we need them to be under a rule, a regulation, or local planning policy, for instance. So I'm curious if you could just talk about how your team goes through that pathway of compliance, where you said at the pointy end, you might end up in the magistrate's court over a particular issue, which is obviously what you would try to avoid where possible.
Yeah, I think that really importantly, at the beginning, and we've certainly been on a bit of a journey that's really required us to kind of build internal awareness about those range of different tools and a range of different responses that we can take as a regulator internally, and certainly with our elected representatives. And working with them to sort of, and it's not always possible to come to some level of sort of agreement about what that approach looks like and how we best respond. So in the vast majority of cases that we do see that we have that escalated response where, you know, the different types of approaches that we might take are responsive or proportionate to the harms that might be created from it. So it might be that we start out with, you know, a community education based approach, that we move to sort of official notices or directions. We're then moving up to things like infringements or prosecutors. But then if we consider things where we've perhaps had, you know, some perpetrator characteristics where we've sort of formed the view that some of these individuals or entities are deliberately, or there's been multiple episodes of non-compliance, then we may need to you know, we may use prosecution of those matters as the first step. So one of the things internally that we've worked on over the last sort of 12 months is developing an enforcement and compliance policy that really sets out what council's approach is. Now, it certainly doesn't seek to, I guess, prevent those discretionary powers and decision makings of our authorised officers, but to really outline how it is local government will respond, so that our community as well kind of have an understanding of how council is approaching these matters.
Thanks, Sam. I think one of the challenges in a local council is that you might end up enforcing compliance when there's a clear breach, but you might have already started that process when you find out that the person or the party that you're trying to enforce compliance on might be the mayor's brother or sister-in-law, or figure out that it's the coach of your kids' local soccer team, and it can get very close and personal, particularly when you get into the smaller communities out in the regions. I might just go back to Susie, who said that she spent quite a bit of time in state government, and just like to talk about that relationship between the differentiation between the roles and responsibilities of state government versus local government. That relationship can be quite antagonistic at times, because local councils might feel like they are always being put upon to do more, potentially with no more resources around the enforcement and compliance aspect, and it feels like the state government has a never-ending increasing demands of what local governments should be doing around regulation of state government legislation. Could you maybe talk about how councils in New South Wales manage that and that relationship with state government?
Yeah, look, it is an issue. Certainly, there's particularly in New South Wales where, for example, under the Protection of the Environment Operations legislation, both councils are appropriate regulatory authorities, as is the EPA, and so often I guess there is a division there of who regulates what, but there has been some transitions in recent years to do with vapour recovery, and just trying to think of the other aspect. That was the main one, but where the state government took, or the EPA took the position of working with councils in terms of training and upskilling, but also in provision of information across to councils about what activities EPA had been working on, and obviously locations. So really helping councils understand the breadth of what what was being asked of them, but also looking to do joint campaigns with councils. So actually walking around with them. So, and I think that is a really great approach to take in terms of sharing information, but also capacity building, and getting that consistency of regulatory I think, Greg, you talked about regulatory posture. So, getting a common look at an issue. So, but it certainly is a challenge when, when things are being shifted to local governments, more and more, regulatory officers are being asked to, while you're out there looking at what's happening with weeds, could you have a look at something, this other issue over here, or whatever it might be. So that particular officer or that group of officers may not have any background in that. They're expected to skill up on that and go out and check that as well. So there's quite a diversity there, and sort of a high demand on their time.
Thanks, Susie. Greg, sort of related to that point, is the question online about what things would make it easier for local government regulators to implement changes in state or Commonwealth legislation. I might throw that to you, Greg.
Sorry, David, could you quickly repeat that?
Yeah, it's a question on the Q&A. What processes would make it easier for local government regulators to implement changes in state or Commonwealth legislation?
I think the clear answer there is working across government and that structured approach to connections. So it's not person dependent, and there's structure in there, and there's reliability of the connections and the ongoing connections between local, state, and federal government. I think that's key. Not only at the back end, implementing end of regulation, because that's one part of it, but at the front end, in law design, in policy design, and to get involved in law reforms at levels of government, because that builds up awareness and understanding along the path, along the way, rather than at the end of the pipe. It's a bit of a common theme, and that's why it's one of Alert's number one objectives is collaboration, because collaboration is principal to everything, but collaboration from the start of processes. So local government, state government, and federal government practitioners are best equipped when it comes down to implementation.
Thanks, Greg. There's a clear difference between Commonwealth, state, and local government, both in size, scale, and also proximity to the regulated entities. And I don't think you can talk about regulation in local government for too long without talking about the balance and split between the role of the elected councillor, the elected council, and the administration. And there tends to be there's a grey areas in roles and responsibilities in local government between the role of the council, the CEO, and administration. There tends to be some harder lines in terms of the black and white split between the role of the council at the policy, strategy, setting the vision and the direction, and then the compliance and enforcement tends to be a hard separation with administration. But like in all things, when you're regulating in your local community, there's some grey areas and some obvious tensions. I might just throw to you, Sam, to talk about whether or not that becomes an issue for your team on the ground in terms of how to balance the being the voice of the community and residents and ratepayers that the council has to undertake, and then your team trying to enforce compliance. Sometimes when that enforcement activity may not be appreciated by the people who
Yeah.
are hearing from you when you're knocking on the door.
Yeah, thanks, David. And I think it's a really fascinating sort of position that local governments occupy when it is so close to community and then also is working so closely with those elected representatives. And, you know, I think that certainly, you know, the role of our elected representatives are really to set that kind of direction and some of those strategic imperatives of council at that broader level. And as you outlined, David, that then some of how that happens is decided at a regulatory level. But even then, we can often have experiences where, you know, what we're doing at an operational level actually doesn't, you know, sort of meet what councillors are wanting from it. So to provide probably a clear example, that it might be that we've got a group of councillors who are particularly concerned about litter and dumping within the municipality. Now, we've formulated a response to address those concerns. It's primarily focused around, you know, community education, capacity building, ensuring regulated entities are aware of what their requirements are. You know, during a council meeting, one of our councillors might then declare a war on waste, which then means that we're having to sort of scramble to kind of, you know, in our view, or based on what they're expecting, is take far more of enforcement-based response, where they're expecting to see increased number of offences, or sorry, increased number of infringements, or increased number of prosecutions. You know, as a demonstration of our outcomes of that war on waste. And I think that it can be problematic and really, really challenging because we're, you know, in sort of responding to those things so rapidly, but also that some of the officers that we might have brought in, who, you know, we brought in because they are particularly skilled in areas around negotiation or community education or capacity building, may be quite different from those officers that we need to take more of that enforcement-based response, who, you know, need skills in investigation and monitoring and using different surveillance tools and techniques and all of that sort of thing. So we operate in this incredibly dynamic environment where, you know, our regulatory positioning and design is very, very quickly influenced by those elected officials.
Thanks, Sam. I'm happy to be accused of having an overly optimistic view of the world and an overly optimistic view of people in general. And my sense is most people are trying to do the right thing. There can be so many different layers of rules and regulations from Commonwealth, state, and then local governments that it's sometimes impenetrable for people to know whether they're trying to start a business or build their dream home or undertake some other small activity, to know how to navigate the labyrinth of rules that they might need to comply with. My general approach, and I'm going to quote my former manager of regulatory services here at the City of Vincent, is that if people are unintentionally doing the wrong thing and they're happy to learn and be educated and shown how to go through the right path to make something safe or ensure there are no negative impacts on their neighbours or the activity that they're undertaking, that we take that education role. There will always be a small subset of what we call the deliberate non-compliers. They know they're doing the wrong thing and they're going to do it anyway. They've been told it's the wrong thing and they choose to, in your example, dump illegal waste in your parks or in the street or in the local reserve. So that's probably the hard edge of local government, that there will have to be some hard action at that pointy end for those deliberate non-compliers. But I'm hoping that's only sort of, you know, less than 2 or 3% of the community who are intentionally doing the wrong thing, and that has those limits have to be set and those rules need to be enforced. There's a question which is being upvoted from the audience based on something you said, Sam, is about how do we measure regulatory success? And I might throw that to Greg, then Susie, and back to you, Sam, about at the local government level, what does regulatory success look like?
Brilliant question. It's been a brilliant question for my 23 years experience in regulation. I don't think anyone's cracked the code, to be honest. And talking to the Europeans and the North Americans, it's a very hard code to crack. But it's not impossible. And it takes a bunch of really clever regulators, which there's plenty of them out there, to come up with ways of doing that. And look, I firmly believe it starts with regulatory priorities. Regulatory success doesn't happen when you're looking at everything all at once. You need to put your blinkers on to what really matters from a strategic point of view from the regulator, and that they're regulatory priorities that are set by your senior leadership group, and then measuring outcomes that are informed by some of your productivity and your outputs from there. If you were to measure regulatory success across your whole remit, it would give you migraine after migraine. If your remit is broad, and most of our remits are broad. So it's about focusing on regulatory priorities, which can be short-term and long-term, and a combination of both. And then really designing your outcomes performance measures that align with those regulatory priorities. So you're telling the story that's backed up with stats. Stats and stories always work. Stories don't work alone because they don't have the context. They don't have the scale. And stats don't work alone because they don't have the context, which is the meaning of what you're achieving. So it is a wicked question, and we're working on that with our international partners actually in doing both of those, building some guidance on building regulatory priorities and outcomes performance measures.
Thanks, Greg. I sometimes like to describe local governments as the peacekeepers in our community. We're trying to keep peace on the streets. We're trying to avoid conflict where possible, avoid that before it happens. But if the conflict's already broken out between neighbours or between a local business and its customers, that we then have to try to resolve and manage that conflict as well as possible. I don't think the sign of success is the absence of complaints. We have to build in that level of complaints, but you do need to take feedback in from your clients, your customers, residents and ratepayers to see if we're getting that balance right of keeping the peace in our community, making sure it's safe and making sure it's prosperous, that people can do what they want to do with their own lives, in their own homes, in their own streets, but not doing that at the detriment of their neighbours or the community in which they live. Susie, could you maybe talk a little bit about how you know if you're succeeding in these regulatory roles at the local government level?
Yeah, look, totally agree with Greg. It is a difficult one. I think Sam's probably sounds like he'll have the more experience on that, but I think prioritising your compliance activities is a really important one, where you can factor in issues around, what is the most urgent from a health and safety perspective. What does our community want us to focus on? What's important to them? So pulling all that together to prioritise where you put your activity is really important. But it's also one of those things where the better you are at regulating, or the more successful you are, there's actually potentially a reduction in how much you need to do. So if you're good at getting that message out of saying this is what we expect from the community, in terms of their behaviour and activities, and they're understanding that, hopefully the enforcement will be less anyway. So anyway, I'll leave it to Sam.
Thanks, Susie. Sam, there's a question here which goes, there's some negative stereotypes of local governments. Some local governments don't help themselves in building positive reputation on particular issues, but there is a question there about how a local council prioritises the use of their scarce resources. And the question is, are councils too willing to spend dollars on regulation that have revenue generation aspects, whether it's licenses, fees, or car parking fees or car parking fines, for instance. Everybody's favorite topic, by the way. There's not a day in local government that I don't see issues around car parking causing concerns and complaints, both in the positive and the negative. Is there enough effort being put on genuine public safety issues like fire safety in buildings, derelict buildings and the like? So can we talk about that issue around what councils get paid to regulate and what they can do through fees and charges, which have a positive impact on the financial sustainability of the organisation, but may take resources away from core compliance issues?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really fascinating question, and perhaps in some ways a bit of an elephant in the room that we can often sort of face when we're having conversations with our elected representatives, or when we're developing budgets, or establishing new services or requesting additional resources. I think a critical part of that does actually go back to how we measure and success, and being very clear that when we're working across those internal departments and when we're with the community, being clear on what success isn't. Success isn't the number of infringements or revenue generated through those infringements. Success isn't necessarily the outcomes that we're getting from a prosecution. It's not really, can't really be measured by the number of food safety inspections that we've performed across our regulated entities. And I think that I'm working internally, and particularly with areas like the finance team and our elected representatives, sort of outlining that, the aim of regulation is far greater than those things. And I have to say that in my experience that there's an appreciation from, both of our elected representatives, those internal areas, of that kind of broader intent, and that it's not about raising revenue. I can understand how that might, feel different to community members, and I think that part of that is, what's underlying that is that we have to do this continued work around, closely listening to our community, but also trying to demonstrate some sort of consistency in how we're responding to these things. So whilst I appreciate that we've got a whole bunch of different legislation, that different entities may warrant a different response and all of that sort of thing, community members see council as a single entity. And they expect that how they might have, their experience in obtaining and being, a food trading permit, or, how they were dealt with when they didn't obtain that, should be the same as how we might deal with, an episode when they've made a breach under the Road Safety Act. So I think it's this constant sort of push and pull, reevaluating, listening carefully to our community about what's working and what's not. And I think that obviously underpinning that is a real understanding of what are those critical things that we cannot, because from an amenity, health, safety impacts that we need to focus on, where we cannot absolutely, that we need a really, really strong response. So what are some of those other things? Well, where yes, it is a breach of law or a breach under an act, but can we take more of a sort of supportive response, I guess, or capacity building response with residents?
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, it's a good point. It's not necessarily fair to treat different areas of an organisation the same, and not fair to necessarily have the same customer satisfaction mechanism for our sport and aquatic and gym facility with very happy customers compared to our rangers doing parking management and enforcing parking on the streets. They're not like for like comparisons. There is a good question here about conflicts of interest well established in your jurisdictions, noting that there was findings of an integrity commission report relating to Tasmanian local governments. And I think that related to conflicts of interest in terms of internal staffing decisions. And the audience member was surprised that none of those were in place. And probably important to note, not just for a local government, but any organisation how important it is to, if you have a regulatory function, to set up the highest level of governance framework to make it clear both to staff internally, to ministers or elected councils, as well as your ratepayers and clients, about how decisions are made, what those processes are. There's a few questions about having compliance and enforcement policies in place, having those public, making sure everybody understands when a council's making a decision or potentially going up a pathway or an escalation of a compliance activity, that it's understood that it's graduated, it's set, it's not arbitrary. We're not just picking on one person or one local business, that there's a framework around this, which is fair and equitable to everyone. And there are checks and balances in how those decisions are made and how appeals can be lodged through the different regulatory avenues. So we are getting close to the end of our 1 hour webinar. So I might ask our speakers just to provide some concluding remarks just around their best advice to regulators in local government, the value of regulation, and what they could think of next in terms of increasing their skills, capacity, sharing knowledge within the sector or with other regulators at state and local government. And I might start with you, Susie, if that's okay.
Sure. Well, firstly, thank you for having me as part of the panel. And I think from a regulatory perspective, I think certainly sharing and collaborating with your peers as a regulator is really important, both with other local governments, and that's where I guess my organisation and similar local government peak bodies around the country aim to do, is to help and support officers learn from one another, and it's also important to collaborate with your state and federal colleagues, I guess, in the sense of influencing the legislation that you're likely to be implementing as well. So, and again, you know, getting involved and providing that feedback. You know, if something's not working, you know, highlight it. And I'm pretty sure you'll find that there's others who think the same. And that's how you get that change happening. Thank you.
Thanks, Susie. I'll throw to you, Greg, for some final remarks.
Final remarks. Thanks, David, and thanks for hosting in a fantastic way. Look, as regulators, we've got more in common than we have differences, and the differences have been pointed out. And I love what you said before, Susie, about, you know, every local government's different. There's 597 of them in Australia and New Zealand, and they're all different operating environments, different maturity levels, different resources. So it comes to the agency and equipping the regulatory agencies with levels of maturity that they can really let their staff shine. So, David, what you were talking about before, and that question that was in the chat about integrity and public trust and confidence. No agency or local government practitioner, or state or national, are alone. We all walk in each other's shoes, and we're stronger together. There's tools out there to build regulatory capability. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We use what the leaders in the past have created and build on that. And that goes the same with maturity of regulatory agencies. There's tools out there to build governance and oversight and stakeholder engagement. There's one thing to have good systems on the inside, but you've got to show them off on the outside to build that public trust and confidence. And that makes it all worthwhile. So, yeah, last remarks is that you're not alone. You're part of the community, you're part of the regulatory system, right across the board, and stay connected, because there's tools out there that are really valuable to you as an individual and your agency.
Thanks, Greg. And Sam, any last thoughts or final remarks or messages of hope for people doing it tough in regulation in local government?
Yeah, look, I think that it's really about sort of seizing those opportunities to kind of bring awareness to this regulatory role and what regulatory practice involves, including all of its complexities and questions and all of that sort of thing, and raising the awareness of some of that sort of stuff internally, so that we can be working across council to kind of be working towards addressing and delivering those those range of functions in the ways that meet the needs of our community members. It's not necessarily a topic that people are particularly passionate about, and I feel that, you know, we as in those roles have to sort of bring that passion and sort of raise and elevate the importance of it and how it does actually intersect very much so with other areas of council as a service provider, as a facility or owner, whatever it may be. I think the other really important thing is really about connecting officers at all levels in with this broader understanding of what regulation is about. So, and I think that that's really, really important from a staff satisfaction perspective, and also sort of drives, I guess, some of those improvements in professional practice as well. That, you know, even with our parking officers who are going out and issuing parking tickets following a breach under the Road Safety Act, that, you know, that whilst there's a community perception of them, that they understand that they are absolutely valued by the organisation and contribute to this much broader role of local government.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, I talked about local councils being the peacekeepers in their community. I also refer to our regulators as sometimes the invisible superheroes in our community. Often you only hear about their work when there's an issue goes wrong or there's a major complaint or a big conflict, but every day these invisible superheroes are making sure that your food is safe to eat, that your buildings aren't going to fall over, that the local pool water is safe to swim in, that the mosquitoes are controlled near your local lake or the river body. Parking is available when you're trying to get somewhere, or you can manage to get an approval to build your dream home, or you can start a new business in the local town centre and make that dream a reality. So it's I do get passionate and excited about it, Sam. I don't think it's too negative. And I think some of the phrasing of some of the regulatory teams, they're not necessarily being called manager of or the regulatory services team like yourselves. It's more focused around those positive aspects of health and well-being in our community and creating those positive results in terms of safety and prosperity and peace in our local community. Thanks so much to Greg, Susie and Sam for your insights. There's a longer list of questions on the chat, which I'll speak to our NRCOP and ANZOG team about recording those, and we'll try to get written responses where possible to you where you've asked a question. And these recordings and the information is all available on the NRCOP and the A-Alert website. Thanks so much for joining us. You will receive a very short evaluation report for this webinar that really does help us respond to that feedback and make sure that we're delivering a series of webinars which are tailored to what you need as regulators at local, state or local government level. The next NRCOP event will be a hybrid event in Hobart on the 27th of March. This is the milestone for NRCOP as we launch the Tasmanian chapter, and that's when NRCOP will truly be a national body with all state and territories having chapters set up. The theme of that event is the public value of regulation and why it matters. The next A-Alert event they'll be hosting is the Global Summit for Implementing and Enforcing Environmental Law. That'll be in Brisbane on the 6th to the 8th of November, working with its partner networks. So please keep an eye on our social media channels, LinkedIn and Twitter, to keep up to date on all our events. If you haven't signed up to be a member of NRCOP or A-Alert, please do now. I think it'll only take you 60 or 90 seconds to join, to be able to get access to the resources, find out further information about events and professional development opportunities, and a great bank of resources that we've talked about today. So I'll wrap it up. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us, and I hope to see you at a NR COP or A-Alert event in the future soon. Thanks, everyone.